シリーズポストコロナ世界における分断と交流、外国人研究者が見たコロナ禍の日本。こんにちは、ナビゲーターのサヘルローズです。このシリーズでは日本に関する研究を行う外国人研究者の皆様をゲストにお迎えいたしまして、コロナ禍という大きな変化の中で日本社会はどのようなことを学んでいくのか、またこの経験がどんな意味を持っていくのか、専門分野からのご意見伺っていきたいと思います。お話を伺う研究者の皆さんは、国際交流基金が世界中から毎年お呼びしている日本研究フェローの方々です。今回のスピーカーはこの方です。
My name is Marvin Sterling. I'm an associate professor of cultural anthropology at Indiana University in the United States.
So Marvin, what was it like to go through the pandemic in Tokyo, both personally and professionally?
Well, for me, being in Tokyo during the pandemic was difficult in the way that it was for most people. It was an anxious time because we didn't know exactly what we were dealing with. We've learned a bit about this virus over the last few months, but I think with the initial outbreak, we obviously knew a lot less than we do now. But there was an added level of anxiety for me at the time because I was conducting research far from home and far away from my family. Professionally, the pandemic was also, of course, a challenge since my research required me to meet people, ideally on an in-person basis, since I needed to attend public events and so on. The pandemic did limit some aspects of my research, but I made adjustments. So instead of meeting in person, I shifted my interviews to Skype and Zoom. I wasn't able to attend all the public events I'd hoped to attend, but I was able to make a few key events before and after the first wave of the pandemic. So I think things turned out okay. I'm also hoping to return to Tokyo soon for a couple of months to make up some of the time that I lost during my research stay. But yeah, it was, like I said, a tough time, but I think I was helped in many ways by the spirit of the people around me. For example, when I went to the supermarket or the convenience stores, people seemed to just, continue conducting business as usual. People were polite and, obviously we all knew that, they were operating under a certain degree of duress. But, in many ways, things really just ran as usual, even though we knew, obviously, that we were in very kind of unusual circumstances. So I did have a feeling that we were all in it together.
How do you think this pandemic will affect the Japanese society and culture in the long run?
Well, whatever room for improvement Japan might have in its pandemic response, and of course there's always a lot of room. Japan seems to be dealing with this crisis better than many other countries. And I'm not the first to comment that there are certain cultural practices and attitudes in Japan that existed before the pandemic that may be stemming the rates of infection. So this includes wearing masks, not so much for your own benefit, but rather for the benefit of the people around you. Even if it's just a matter of routine, I think that attitude of concern for the people around you has saved a lot of lives. It's not an attitude that you find in every country. So even though the situation in Japan is obviously grim in terms of public health, economically, and so forth, and even as we experience wave after wave of infections, comparatively speaking, Japan might find itself on the path to recovery faster than many other countries. One of the challenges that this pandemic will pose to Japan, I think, is to its ability to reimagine interpersonality, how we engage with each other in new ways. But this reimagination isn't just a matter of modality, like Zoom meetings and so on, but also who we engage with and how we understand those people we're engaging with. So COVID has been another reminder, I think, that Japan is part of a world that's increasingly interconnected. Japan has become more ethnically diverse as a society, especially in urban areas. And so I think one key effect of this pandemic will be that it'll lend a new sense of urgency to the question of how that diversity is appreciated and managed. So of course that management will ultimately be in the service of bringing this pandemic under control. But I think that a critical part of that effort will need to involve respecting the well-being and dignity of all people living in Japan.
What was your research about?
So my research explores the experiences of Japanese people who are partly of African descent. I'm interested in understanding how this increasingly visible group of people characterize their experiences of life in Japan, and also some reasons why those characterizations might vary depending on whom I'm talking to. I'm also more broadly interested in understanding what insights these stories permit us into how Japanese society more generally imagines what it means to be Japanese at this particular moment in its history. And then at a broader scale of analysis, I want to use the Black-Japanese instance as a way of reflecting on the history and especially the present of Afro-Asian cultural, political, and other kinds of exchanges.
Fascinating. Please tell me more about it.
Sure. So my interest in this research began when I was with my family in Jamaica during the 2016 Rio Olympics. So we were watching Usain Bolt, the great Jamaican sprinter, anchor the 4x100 meter relay team to victory. So I noticed a dark-complexioned Japanese runner who was right behind Bolt and who brought the Japanese team to an impressive second-place finish. So I had this sudden thought that, maybe he was partly of Jamaican descent, and it turned out that he was. So this is Eska Cambridge, who was born on the other side of the island in Montego Bay in 1993. So his mom is Japanese and his father is Jamaican. So I made this guess about his Jamaican ancestry because about 18 years before, I conducted research on Japanese interest in Jamaican popular and religious culture, mainly in Tokyo and Yokohama, but also in Kingston. And this is where, a lot of Japanese folks were pursuing their interest in this culture. I knew that over time there developed a small community of Japanese people living in Kingston, which is the capital city, and that there were cases of Japanese and Jamaicans marrying each other and having kids, sometimes continuing to live in Jamaica, but sometimes moving to Japan. So I'd previously known about Ariana Miyamoto, whose father is African American, and who won Miss Universe Japan back in 2015. I later on became aware of other Black Japanese celebrities, like the Japanese 100-meter dash world record holder Abdul Hakim Sani Brown, who is partly of Ghanaian heritage. There's Rui Hachimura, the NBA player with the Washington Wizards, whose father is from Benin. And of course, Naomi Osaka, who is the great tennis player, whose father, like Cambridge's, is also from the Caribbean, but in this case, Haiti. So over the last few decades, people all across the globe have traveled to and taken up residence in Japan for educational and professional opportunities unavailable to them in their home countries. And so this includes people from across the African diaspora, of course. So for example, many of the African parents of some of the Black Japanese individuals who are the focus of my research initially arrived to the country starting in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s in search of opportunities as small-scale entrepreneurs, as students, as artists, as manual laborers, and other professionals. So this more recent dimension of the Black presence in the country is combined with the long-standing presence of Black military personnel as well as students, English instructors, and other professionals from the United States and other sites across the African diaspora. So another dimension of this kind of neoliberal Afro-Asian encounter that I'm interested in has been the travel of Japanese cultural entrepreneurs who want to engage African diasporic cultural expressions like hip-hop, reggae, gospel, djembe drumming, and so on, these kinds of African cultural expressions at the sites of origin, including places like Jamaica, Africa, and the United States. So the Black Japanese individuals who are at the center of my research have been born of these overseas encounters as well. So the number of these individuals have grown over the years. So while we don't have the numbers of Black Japanese individuals in particular, the Ministry of Health reports that each year 20,000 children, or 2% of all annual births in Japan, are children who were born with, of one non-Japanese parent. So thus far in my research, I've interviewed 20 Black Japanese individuals, most of whom are in their 20s and 30s, which is consistent with the moment in which I was conducting my previous research on Jamaican culture in Japan as a distinctive element of a broader and increased Japanese engagement with African diasporic culture and society in Japan, the United States, in the Caribbean, and of course in Africa itself. And so to contextualize the stories of my Black Japanese research participants, I also interviewed 4 parents and one individual whose parents are of African descent, but who was later raised in a family with his divorced mother, his Japanese stepfather, and Black Japanese siblings. So I'm hoping to expand the numbers of research participants in all categories as my research progresses. So during the interviews, I asked participants to describe their early lives, their present circumstances, their expectations for the future, and also their sense of the way forward for Japanese society pertaining to issues of diversity. And so in reviewing those interviews that I've gathered so far, several themes are starting to emerge. So the first theme involves the use of the term Haafu to identify a mixed race identity. So nearly everyone I spoke to recognized the term as problematic, to the extent that it suggested that so-called Haafu are not completely Japanese. So some people I spoke with explicitly rejected the term for this reason. And so instead they might identify themselves as Japanese or recognize their dual ethnic heritage or rejected categorization to the extent that they could. Maybe a small majority, however, despite some measure of discomfort with the term, rather than rejecting it outright, simply saw it as like the common term through which they are identified by majority Japanese. So that's the first theme. The second theme pertains to the areas where the individual grew up. All right, so Black Japanese research participants who grew up in Japan generally seem to feel that they generally seem to want to more strongly identify as Japanese. On the other hand, those who grew up outside of Japan, like in the United States or the Caribbean or in Africa, they tended to less expect or care whether majority Japanese recognize them as Japanese. Rather, they viewed their Japanese identities as something that they could continue to craft, such as through fuller acquisition of language skills or other forms of cultural competency on their own terms, that is, without feeling such a great need for approval from the majority. While both groups, those who were mostly raised in Japan versus those who were raised elsewhere, so while both groups tended to identify in fairly fluid terms, given their multicultural experiences, those who grew up outside Japan perhaps exhibited a greater tendency in this direction. The third theme concerns bullying, which again is another issue that I asked about specifically. Most of my research participants who grew up in Japan unsurprisingly described situations, especially in school, where their phenotypic difference was recognized by the other students. So some describe this recognition as not necessarily ill-intentioned, but rather just the result of kind of a natural curiosity of young children. For some students who went to international schools or other institutions where there happened to be other mixed race Japanese youth, or who moved across several grades with the same cohort, bullying often wasn't a big issue. For many of the research participants who were raised in Japan, however, it was. So even into their 20s, several research participants described the pain they felt and continue to feel from having been teased and abused by their peers. Some said their peers described their skin as kitanai, or dirty, or said, that they got into fights or described annoying behavior, such as their classmates hiding their belongings. Some research participants, though, described being able to fight back. So one woman in her 20s described herself as intolerant, even when she was a child, of being bullied. And this was an attitude that, to some degree, she could afford to have because her sister went to the same school and was also the sort of person who was not to be trifled with. So she said the boys who might have tried to give her a hard time, in fact, became cowed by this double threat of these two no-nonsense Black Japanese sisters. So a fourth theme concerns how Black Japanese research participants are routinely not recognized by majority Japanese as Japanese, even today, even though they've spent their entire lives in Japan. So they commonly describe being commended on for their Japanese language ability, on their evident ability to perform this or other signs of Japaneseness, even again as they, spent their entire lives in the country. So they describe being pulled over by the police, asked to show their papers, and then, the police would depart after my research participants explained that they were, in fact, Japanese citizens. So this, I think, speaks to the dense, kind of compounded intersectionalities that constitute a socially viable claim to Japanese identity. To be Japanese is to look Japanese, it's to also speak Japanese, and to comport yourself as Japanese, and to otherwise engage with other Japanese people fluidly as Japanese, and also to be a Japanese citizen. And so the absence of any one of these elements, such as is evidenced by dark skin, is enough to lead many majority Japanese to assume that the person in question is a foreigner. So the next two themes concern parents and parenting. So this theme concerns the anxiety that many fully Black parents and many fully Japanese parents have about their ability to counsel their children specifically about the experience of being mixed race. So several indicated to me going through difficult points in their lives surrounding feelings of rejection by mainstream society, including the bullying and misrecognition as foreigners that I mentioned just now. So they described their keen awareness of their parents' love and concern for them, but also felt to some degree their parents' inability to fully understand and mitigate their suffering as Black Japanese. So what are the implications of this research? One concerns the notion of multicultural coexistence, or tabunka kyosei, in Japan. So this is a term that has been used by the Japanese government on the national, regional, and municipal levels to describe the effort to harmoniously incorporate foreigners brought to Japan, partly along the currents of neoliberal globalization. The term multicultural coexistence suggests that this challenge is principally a matter of overcoming and managing cultural difference. And this is true to some extent. Foreigners come from diverse backgrounds and are faced with the challenge of learning Japanese, how to sort garbage, and learning what to do in case of natural disasters, how to navigate the medical system, and so forth. But Japanese youth involvement in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has also suggested the relevance of not just cultural knowledge or lack thereof, but also of race specifically as a reading of the biological body. So what specifically race-based experiences one's different, for example, from those of Japanese who are partly of European descent, might motivate many Black Japanese youth to embrace Black Lives Matter. So I think a more robust concern for multicultural coexistence in Japan, therefore, might involve engaging with how the experiences of Black Japanese might not just be a matter of cultural knowledge and practice, but also a matter of Japanese social imaginings of racial blackness.
いかがだったでしょうか。シリーズポストコロナ世界における分断と交流、外国人研究者が見たコロナ禍の日本。次回もぜひご覧くださいね。ナビゲーターはサヘルローズでした。